Thank you so much.
For the next session, it's my pleasure to request Professor Navneet Thakkar to kindly moderate. Dr. Navneet Thakkar is professor in obstetrics and gynecology in GMCH 32 Chandigarh. She's also the website chairperson of the Indian Menopause Society. And menopause is in fact her field of interest. And I think most of you already know her. She is a very wonderful person, always smiling. And I would request her to introduce the speakers for this third session. Dr. Navneet, please.
Thank you, Dr. Saurabh, for a very kind introduction. And at the outset, since we are running late, I'll introduce both my eminent speakers. The first is I have great privilege to introduce Dr. Usha Datta. She is the professor and head of gastroenterology at PGI Chandigarh and a very meritorious person from the best undergraduate student in medicine in 1988. She has recently been awarded in 2021 with the Rakesh Tandon Award for Best Mentor. And she'll be speaking on a very important topic which concerns our methodology, that is types of clinical trial and research design. My second speaker is Dr. Apul Goel from King George Medical College, Lucknow. He's a professor in urology, very associate editor of Indian Journal of Urology, and is a recipient of Professor Dhanvendra Kumar Young Investigator Gold Medal. So his topic is very new to us, that is pseudo journals and plagiarism. So I first invite my first speaker, Professor Usha Datta, to speak on her topic, types of clinical trials and research designs. Professor Usha, please. She's a
Thank
very
you.
dear friend of mine.
Thank you, Navneet. It is a very difficult task to speak on study designs in 12 minutes. So pardon me if I cannot complete the whole gamut because this is a whole day program on just study designs. So I'll quickly go through the essential components. I've kept it very simple and brief. So study designs, what is research? You know, why we bothered about the study design is because we cannot study the whole population for which we are trying to find an answer. Suppose I want to study all the menopausal women in the whole world. If today I start a study and tomorrow I finish, I cannot recruit all of them. It's not practically possible. And somebody may be entering into menopause, somebody may be apparently in menopause, but then may have some more thing which may change the status of the patient, or say if I'm studying all the diabetics in the world, tomorrow one more person may be getting diagnosed as diabetes. So it is not possible to study the whole population of any disease. It's not practical. For all you know, there may be some astronauts in space. So we draw a small representative and an adequate sample in which it is feasible to conduct a study. And that is the small n. So always in our studies, we only talk of small n. We never talk of the big N. And this is a small study sample where we observe and analyze them in detail and analyze which kind of a study design. The analysis depends upon that. And then we extrapolate the outcome to the whole population appropriately and conservatively. So this is where we again need statistics. So here we need the descriptive statistics. Here we need the analytical statistics. Just one second, the slide is not moving. 1 minute. Yeah. So what are the key terms? I will just introduce you to a few key terms. The key terms are exposure and outcome. Exposure means the risk factor and outcome means the disease of interest. So let us say smoking is an exposure factor for lung cancer, or smoking for endometrial cancer, or HPV for cervical cancer. So we are talking of exposure and outcome. So this is, we have to be very clear what we are talking about. Or say maternal sepsis and preterm labor. So maternal sepsis becomes the exposure and the outcome is the preterm labor. So these two terms, once we are clear of, the next term which we need to know is presence of exposure or absence of exposure. So you need a control arm, and presence of outcome versus no outcome. So here the exposure group is controlled by a group which is not getting exposure. In today's day, there is no role of doing any study in which there is no control arm. So it's very important to have a control arm. And in both of these, we are going to study whether the outcome is present or absent. So the next component is, are we going to study from exposure to outcome, or are you going to study from outcome to exposure? So exposure to outcome, suppose I'm studying a group of smokers versus non-smokers, following them up over a period of 20 years and seeing whether they develop lung cancer or not. So this is like a typical cohort study. So you're going from exposure to outcome. The next component is whether we are studying exposure and outcome in a reverse manner. That means the lung cancer has happened and we pick up controls who don't have lung cancer and check whether they are smokers or not. So we are going retrospectively backwards to see whether they had the risk factor or not. So that is called a retrospective study, in which, and this will be a case control because you're having cases and here you're having controls. And if you do it in a snapshot, you can see here there is a black box outside it. It's like a snapshot. A patient comes to you with lung cancer. You ask him, did you smoke today? And another patient comes without lung cancer. You ask him, do you smoke today? So that is like a cross-sectional snapshot kind of a thing. Those studies are very commonly done, but they cannot tell us whether the smoking caused the lung cancer or the lung cancer is associated with smoking. Maybe a person has been diagnosed to have, say, small cell cancer of the lung, and because he is depressed, he hasn't told his family he starts smoking. So we cannot say what is the direction of the whole thing, and that is the reason that is a cross-sectional study. Now, after having introduced you to these terms, I will use these terms when I'm going to describe the study designs. So study designs are predominantly two, very simple. One is, what are you going to do? If you're going to only observe, it becomes observational studies. If you're going to intervene, it becomes interventional studies. The next point is, observational studies are of various types. They can be descriptive, that means you're only describing and there is no control arm. Whereas it can be analytical, in which you're going to describe and also analyze vis-a-vis a control. So observational studies can be descriptive or analytical. Analytical will have a control arm. Now, descriptive is what very commonly we all do. One case we see, then we write a report about it. That's a case report. So if you realize in your case report, there's no controls. Then you have 4 or 5 of the same kind of cases, then you describe, then that becomes a case series. Again, there is no control. Then you do a cross-sectional study. Then in the cross-sectional study, you are studying the exposure and the outcome at the same point of time. And that is a typical cross-sectional study. Case control study is, say we are taking patients with lung cancer and those without lung cancer and checking out whether they were smokers or not. That becomes a case control study. Then comes the king of the observational studies, that is the cohort study. And as Dr. Madhumita and Dr. Meenu Singh were trying to elaborate, that the validity of the study is highest with the randomized control trial, and among the observational studies, it is with a cohort study. So in order to keep your validity high, you have to go through the complexities and hence try and plan a cohort study if you can't do a randomized control trial. Otherwise, if you can plan, you should always try and plan a randomized control trial, to which I will come to. So why do we need the validity? Because various times, even the oral contraceptive trials, which were based on case control studies, later on was disproven when cohort studies were done. So various recommendations of societies change based on the validity of the data, and cohort studies amongst the observational studies has the highest validity. Now, as I said, a cross-sectional study is exposure and outcome. So suppose I'm looking at triglyceride levels, or suppose I'm looking at patients with fatty liver and I'm measuring their lipid profile as of that day. So I will have the fatty liver on the ultrasound and I've taken a sera sample and looked at their lipid profile. I'm measuring it on that day as a snapshot, and that is a cross-sectional study, a typical cross-sectional study. So in a cross-sectional study, you can have control. So you can take fatty liver patients versus non-fatty liver patients and assess their lipid profile on that day, and that becomes a an example of a cross-sectional study. Now, a case control study, as I said, from outcome, you go back and see whether they were smokers or non-smokers. And patients who did not have lung cancer, you go back and see whether they were smokers or non-smokers. And you see the directional arrow, you're going backwards. So case control study is always retrospective. And retrospective studies always have a lot of issues regarding recall bias and regarding measurement bias and a large number of biases. So it is easy to do in a hospital kind of a setting, and it is useful to do in rare conditions, like even in cervical cancer. It has been shown that all the risk factors for cervical cancer was brought out by case control studies. So case control studies are a very good, useful initial starting tool for rare diseases to start with, to understand what are the risk factors operating. But however, cohort study, as I told you, was the king of all the observational studies, because you're going from exposure to outcome. That means the disease hasn't happened when you have taken the patient. So say I take all Punjab University students and pick out those who are smokers versus non-smokers, follow them up by email or WhatsApp or Signal or whatever method over the next 15 or 20 years, and see whether they developed any features of lung disease or lung cancer. So I'm going from exposure to outcome. So this is the most ideal study design, to be sure that there's a temporal association between the risk factor and the outcome. Now comes randomized control trial. Randomized control trial is just an extension of a cohort study. All that it is that you randomize them to receive the intervention or not. So we cannot randomize people to start up smoking or stop smoking. So you cannot do a randomized control trial in all situations. However, you can do a randomized control trial to give one kind of tocolytic agent versus another kind of tocolytic agent, or you can give randomized control trial of tocolysis versus placebo and see whether that helped in prolonging the duration of labor. So there you can randomize. So wherever it is ethical to randomize, you can randomize. If it is not ethical to randomize, then we use a cohort study design. So as Dr. Madhumita was trying to say, there are various kinds of saris which you have to select. I think she specifically chose this example because a large number of participants here must be women. So similar to that, the study design you choose based on what you need for that particular study question. So here, let me elaborate to what is a cohort study. A cohort is a defined group of people who share a common characteristics within a defined period. So it was used as a term in Roman army, a unit of 480 men who are all marching forwards. So a simple definition of cohort is a defined group of people who are marching forwards in time from exposure to outcomes, from smoking to lung cancer, from HPV infection to cervical cancer, from oral contraceptive use to malignancy, or vitamin D exposure to prevention of osteoporosis, or any kind of, it can be a positive outcome, it can be a negative outcome, but basically you're going from the exposure to outcome. Now, this is a diagrammatic representation of a cohort study. Just follow me with this. You have healthy people, as I said, students in Punjab University at the age of 20. Some are smokers. Those are the red dots are smokers and the blue dots are non-smokers. And in your diary, you have separated them into smokers and non-smokers. And so they are the exposed and the non-exposed. And then when you go forward in time with them, some people will develop disease. You can see the yellow dots have developed disease. So you can notice that even in the control group, some people have developed the disease. So diseased and non-diseased. And now you can see what happens here. In the analysis, you find that, just one second. In the analysis, you can find that you have the number of people who develop the disease among the smokers divided by the number of people who develop the disease among the non-smokers, and that is as simple as relative risk. So it is as simple as this, that you follow healthy people. Some are smokers, non-smokers, divide them to smokers, non-smokers. Some develop lung cancer, some develop here also. So number of people who develop lung cancer among smokers divided by number of people who develop lung cancer among smokers. So we expect this to be higher. So I would expect a relative risk of about 10 in such a situation. So that means smokers are at 10 times increased risk for developing lung cancer. So here what we picked up a population with exposure, that is Punjab University students who are smokers versus Punjab University students who are not smokers. We cannot take all the people, and hence we will take a sample out of it and then follow them up over a period of time and need to find the outcome. And the outcome should be in a way that we do not have any measurement bias. So here we find outcome over a 10-year period. Some people have developed outcome and some people have not developed outcome. We may use a CT scan or whatever to make a diagnosis. Now, cohorts are of 3 types: descriptive, analytical, and interventional. Descriptive, let us see a patient of hepatitis B, a cohort of hepatitis B. We follow over 20 years. They can have varying outcomes and we try and record the outcome of such a situation. The next is a situation of an analytical cohort. You can replace this hepatitis B by HPV. So HPV positive versus HPV negative, you go on to see what has been the outcome vis-a-vis their cervical cancer incidence. The interventional cohort, one village gets vaccination, or some people get the COVID vaccine, some people don't get. It is a non-randomized thing, and you go and see what happens in their relation to COVID infection. So the next comes the terminology of prospective versus retrospective. So let me make it very clear. If the disease has happened, it is retrospective. If the disease is yet to happen, it is prospective. So that is all we need to know on this slide. Yeah. So prospective versus retrospective. So let us see, even in cohorts, there is a concept of retrospective cohort. I will not go into details, but here we understand that prospective cohort, a person has had a group which is exposed, unexposed, going forward in time and seeing disease or no disease. This is a prospective cohort. But consider a person who is, a disease has already happened. You go back to history about 50 years back and see whether they were exposed or not exposed, and coming forward see whether they have disease or not, no disease. The disease has already occurred, so it's retrospective. But because you're going from exposed and non-exposed to disease, then it is a cohort study. So let me give you a very simple example of a retrospective cohort study, which you can understand. You all must be familiar with the Framingham Heart Study, in which coronary artery disease versus no coronary artery disease was the outcome. And somebody had an interesting idea, maybe highly sensitive CRP is a marker of risk for coronary artery disease. And here you see they went back to old banked samples, blood bank samples, and from that they separated out those with increased CRP versus no increased CRP, and went forward in time and saw whether they developed CAD or not. So they went back and classified them based on their CRP, and then went forward and saw whether they had CAD or no CAD. So this is an example of a retrospective cohort study. Now, prospective cohort versus RCT, as I told you, it's simple. Here we are having both in cohort study, it's naturally allocated group. In RCT, we have allocated them by a random association, random manner. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a research study that prospectively assigns human participants to health-related interventions to evaluate the effect of outcome. So it can be a clinical trial is a research study where we have prospectively assigned them to HPV vaccination to assess whether their cervical cancer incidence is lower or not. It's as simple as that. So next point with the thing which Dr. Meenu Singh and Dr. Madhumita were trying to highlight is that systematic reviews and randomized control trial are at the top of the validity order, and that should be used for making any guidelines. And RCT again has the same principle as what we talked about cohort study. And here you can see, here you have randomizing them into 2 groups. And the method of analysis remains relative risk. Now, let me take a very
Dr.
simple
Usha,
example.
Dr. Usha, please a little
Yeah,
faster.
okay. I'll finish another 2 minutes. Just to give you an example, say a dengue papaya study. Dengue and papaya, we know that some people say it increases the platelets, but that is not a controlled trial on which we can base our treatment. So you have papaya extract versus no treatment. So we have added a control arm. So that becomes a control trial. Then we added a placebo, then it becomes a placebo controlled trial. Then we randomize them, it becomes a randomized control trial. Then we conceal the allocation and we blind to improve the quality of our study. And then we have, in order to prevent any observer bias, we also say that the number of patients in whom the platelet increased by 5,000. See, now we have made our outcome more objective. So it increases the quality of the study. And then we register it in CTRI and we blind the statistician so that there's no bias at the time of analysis. And then we use consort guidelines to report it. And then we also find that at the end of the study, 100 patients got into 70 into one arm and 30 into the other. So we have a method called blocking by which we ensure that nearly equal numbers are there in both the groups. So randomization is required to balance both the groups, and I'll come to the last slides. So it tells us whether the effect which we are seeing, the difference in both the groups is due to the drug or all the other things. All these things get balanced by randomization. So concealment means you should not be aware what the next patient is going to get. So we use an opaque sealed envelope or we use serially labeled identical containers. So I think I will skip this part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Usha. That was wonderful. And you really helped us how to design methodology. I think the postgraduates who have joined must have really benefited also, in addition to us also. Thank you, Dr. Usha. Thank you very much. I now invite my second speaker, Dr. Apul Goyal, and he will be talking on a very burning topic, that is plagiarism and pseudo journals. Dr. Apul Goyal is professor in urology. Dr. Apul, please.
Thank you, organizers, and especially Dr. Nirja Chawla for this invitation. I'll be discussing two topics. Both are very controversial: plagiarism and pseudo journals. Both these topics have lots of gray areas, but I have tried to make this presentation very simple and very, very practical. And again, thank you for inviting me to this platform. So what is plagiarism? So Wikipedia defines plagiarism as representation of another author's language, thoughts, ideas, or expression as one's own original work. So if you see this definition, it's quite wide. It includes language, thoughts, ideas, or expression. So practically everything is involved. And another important fact is that it has to be of another authors. So this I'll come back to this when I'll be discussing about self-plagiarism. So there are many different types of plagiarism. Some websites mention there are about 10 types. I'll be discussing, because of paucity of time, some important types of plagiarism. So number one is the global plagiarism, where someone takes the entire work of somebody else and passes it off as their own. So this is very rare, and it's in today's world, it's very likely that it will be caught. The second type, which is the most commonest type, is the paraphrasing plagiarism. Paraphrasing means that you rephrase a piece of text in your own words. So paraphrasing itself is not plagiarism as long as you properly cite your source. I'll show you an example in the next slide. So paraphrasing becomes plagiarism when you read a source and then rewrite its key points as if they were your own ideas. So if you see, there's some material written here, which is the original text written by Cronin in 1995. Another author has rewritten it entirely. It's totally paraphrased, but the correct method is that he has cited the original thought from which it has been taken. So if you do this, then it is not a then this is not plagiarism. But if you don't cite the idea from where you have taken it, then it becomes plagiarism. So even if see, it's only an idea. The person here has not taken any word, not copied anything here, but still, because the idea was taken from the previous text, so you need to cite it. Otherwise, it becomes plagiarism. Another type of plagiarism is verbatim plagiarism, where you copy paste. So when you directly copy text from a source and paste it in your own document without attribution, you are not citing from where you have taken it. If the structure and majority of the words are the same as in the original, then this is plagiarism, even if you delete or change a couple of words here and there. So if you take the major text, you change a few words, but it still remains plagiarism. So it's very easy to avoid this plagiarism. So if you want to choose, if you like, there's something that you really like and you want to take it in your text, so you do two things. You put it in inverted in quotation marks, so there has to be quotation marks, and then number two, you cite it. So if you do these two things, then it is not plagiarism. See, this is an example of this verbatim copy paste type of plagiarism. So this is on your right, you can see a typical report that we get when we put a manuscript in a plagiarism software. On the top, you see the overall similarity. For this paper, it is about 34%. And then you see this is the original text, and this article on the left has copied it verbatim. So it's totally a copy and paste. But if you see this text, whatever has been copied comprises 5% of the total plagiarism that has happened. Of the 34%, 5% comes from here. So again, this is important, and I'll come back to this 5% again in my next slide. So another type of plagiarism is the mosaic plagiarism, which is also known as the patchwork plagiarism. Here, what you do is you copy phrases, passages, and ideas from different sources and put them together to create a new text. So what you do, you have 5 papers in front of you. You choose 5 lines from one paper, 2 lines from another, and you mix them together. Okay. So it includes slightly rephrasing passages while keeping many of the same words and structure as the original. For example, again, if you see there, this paper has copied text from 2 sources. So again, this is the report that we get when we put the manuscript in the plagiarism software. So overall similarity again here is 34%, and the number 3 reference says that the degree of copying is 2%. And again, this is 7. So here it is 2. It is 5% from another source. So, but this pink area is 2% of the total plagiarized manuscript. So as I had shown in the first slide in the definition of plagiarism, so basically the definition means that you have copied or taken from another author's work, but you can still have self-plagiarism. So basically it's self-contradictory. Self-plagiarism word is self-contradictory. It's basically an oxymoron. So it can be, you can say, a misnomer, but this happens. Self-plagiarism is a clear-cut misconduct. So when an author reuses portion of their own published and copyrighted work in subsequent publication without attributing the previous publication, so you can self-plagiarize. You can copy things from your own written article. Okay. So now it comes, what is the acceptable percentage of plagiarism which is acceptable? So again, there's lack of consensus. There's no clear-cut guidelines. Typically, if you see, most sites mention that similarity less than 15% is probably acceptable. But as I had shown in these slides, even though this gentleman has copied only 2%, but still this is plagiarism. So what you have to be careful is that even in the case of less than 15% similarity, if the matching text is one continuous block of borrowed material, it will be considered as plagiarized. Okay, so you have to be very careful. You just can't copy a full entire paragraph, although it may still be less than 15%, but still it is plagiarized. But obviously standard terminologies or methods, some methods they are acceptable. So I'll suggest the best policy is to keep it at 0%. You can, everything can be cited or it can be rewritten. Don't copy the exact words from a different paper. So a common mistake that I see is that people copy images from the internet. There are so many images today that are available on Google, so, and graphs and so many other things. And sometimes we think that probably these images can be copied. So don't do that. This is again plagiarism. There are certain exceptions. For example, textbooks and encyclopedias, they are basically summaries of other scholars' work. So there is a little leeway, and it is basically accepted that if you copy a little, then probably it is acceptable. So depending on the type of plagiarism that has been performed, you can grade the severity of misconduct that has been done. And it can be very, very serious if there's global plagiarism. As I mentioned, it's primarily some other person's work that someone else is claiming to be their own. Paraphrasing plagiarism, again, it is a serious misconduct. So you can define the degree of severity of the misconduct according to the type of plagiarism that has been done. So how do I know if the manuscript has been plagiarized? So what happens, as faculty members, what happens, many residents who don't know the meaning of plagiarism, they write a manuscript and they bring it to you for, for your opinion. So they probably do not know. And if you are, for example, my institute has a authenticate software, our institute has subscribed to it, so we can put manuscripts on that authenticate software, and it will tell us whether it has been plagiarized and to what degree it has been plagiarized and what sources from where it has been plagiarized. If you don't have access to this paid software like Authenticate, so there are plenty of free softwares that are available on the internet, and you can use any of them. Now, coming to the second portion of my presentation, which is on pseudo journals. As I mentioned, these are all controversial topics and there are lots of gray areas. So many people use the word predatory journals for pseudo journals. So why this term predatory? So predatory refers to the fact that these entities prey on academicians for financial profit via article processing charges, APCs. These words are getting more common today. We all understand what APC stands for open access articles. Again, this is, I hope people know what open access articles mean. Typically, if you see, if you don't have subscription to a journal, so these articles are mostly blocked, you can't access them. So if you want to read a full text of a particular article, you need to buy it from the publisher. So, but now what has happened, many articles are open access where basically the author pays and for the reader it is free. So these are called as open access articles, and now we have so many journals that publish only open access articles. So if the predatory means that you are charged but by a journal that doesn't meet scholarly publishing standards, so this is what so that is why this term predatory came. So but this word is controversial, so because what happens, authors publishing in such journals are often aware that these journals do not adhere to accepted standards but choose to publish in them anyway. So here it is not, they are not prey, actually they already know what they are into. So this predatory words is a sort of a little controversial, and probably pseudo journals is probably a more accurate term, but still because predatory has stuck, so mostly we still use the word predatory journals. So how do you define predatory journals? So there are 4 or 5 characteristics of these predatory journals. So they basically prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship. They are characterized by false or misleading information. There's deviation from best editorial and publication practices in the form of uh, peer review. There's hardly any peer review. There's lack of transparency. and they use aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. So if you have a few articles, if you have authored a few articles, so if you see your spam folder, it will be littered with invitations to submit to journals tangentially related to your field. So every researcher now today gets so many invitations. So the invitations, so typically otherwise journals, we find it difficult to publish. In the standard journals, it is so difficult to publish, but these journals are asking us to submit papers in their journals. So they solicit in articles, so might even have invitation to join an editorial board. And the peer review process is in the name only, and almost any submission can be published as long as the fee is paid. So in a credible journal or in a normal journal, it's very difficult to get an article published. But in predatory journals, you just walk in, anything that you submit will get published. So this is my spam box. So in 5 days, you can see there are 18 invitations by different journals. And a problem with them is that they're difficult to detect. Their names are almost indistinguishable from reputed journals. The journal titles offer variation on popular publications using common words like international. So if you have a journal of urology, which is reputed, it becomes an international journal of urology, or international journal of urological research. So the names are quite, you can't, just by reading the name, you can't pick up whether it's a genuine journal or it's a predatory journal. So there are many websites that help you in identifying these predatory journals. A very popular site is the thinkchecksubmit.org. So you can go to the site where it will help you in identifying whether the journal in which you are planning to submit is a genuine journal or is it a predatory journal. There are so many tools today. For example, this review article published last year, so they have done a review on all the potential predatory biomedical journals, how to detect. There are so many software, so many, there are more than 100, ways. Authors have told various methods by which you can detect these predatory journals. So another simple way is to go to this directory of open access journal. You can see whether the journal in which you are intending to submit your article, whether it is listed here or not. And this is how the website looks. It has about a listing of about 16,000 journals, and it has journals of 80 languages. So you can see whether the journal in which you intend to publish is listed here or not. If it is listed, then it's a genuine journal and you can go ahead. But this is again not easy, because as I showed, there are so many different methods by which you can find out whether it is a predatory or a genuine journal, and no method is ideal. If you see, there are 4 different methods here, and there's an overlap. So there is no best way to identify whether a journal is really predatory or not. So in spite of all the homework that you do, you may still land up with a journal which is a predatory journal. So there are some websites also that can be consulted in case you are still confused. So one is the World Association of Medical Editors, the WAME group, the Committee on Publication Ethics, the COPE group, and the ICMJE, and the Council of Science Editors. So all these sites you can go, and it will help you in identifying whether the journal is a predatory or a genuine journal. And thank you so much for giving me this platform. Thank you.
I think, Dr. Apul, we need to thank you. You've given us so much clarity on a gray area. Thank you very much. Over to the chairpersons.
Thank you, Dr. Navneet. There are a few questions. One of them is from Dr. Madhumita, who was one of the previous speakers. She asked Dr. Goel, how can students check the similarity index of their manuscripts free of charge? I think you had already covered a part of it in your talk.
Yes.
Like Grammarly and some, but are there any others that are easily available free of charge?
Yeah, you can, anyone can search on the Google. If they put this free plagiarism check software, And in the initial few pages, you can choose any one. Actually, I haven't used them practically because my institute has this Authenticate.
Yeah.
So I use Authenticate. So, but when I was, preparing for this presentation, I saw there are many free, sites that help you in this.
So in PGI, we use Turnitin software, which is again a paid software. And my personal experience is that, it's a bit like it's analogous to free antivirus softwares. So there are like free antivirus software, they are there, they do the job, but they're never quite as good as the paid subscribed software. So these free antivirus software available on the net are never quite as exhaustive and complete as Authenticate, which is the industry standard, by the way, and Turnitin, which is another very popular paid software. So Dr. Madhumita again asks Professor Goel, as the editor of an Indian journal, can you give feedback about the problem of plagiarism and duplicate submissions plaguing Indian research? So is it something which is more plaguing Indian research, or is it a global phenomenon?
Yeah, see, it's global phenomena, but Indian Journal of Urology, of which I am associated with, is a relatively small journal. We produce only 4 issues in a year, so we do not, get so many articles like that. But yes, if you see the literature, then of course there are so many issues regarding Indian research where you have plagiarism, because this concept is still sinking in. Initially, we did not understand the meaning because copy paste, when computers came, it became so simple, copying and pasting, So every seminar and anything you see, it's all copy pasted. But then things are gradually evolving. We are learning, and things are getting better and with less plagiarism. Like workshops like these, they are helping people to understand the concepts.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of plagiarism is actually taught right from a young age in Western countries, and in India, get to know about it only after you've become a researcher. Question from somebody who says that, could you advise regarding preprint servers? Can you just mention one line about preprint servers, Dr. Goel?
Okay, so this concept of preprints is coming up. So now what happens even before the peer review happens? So the journal hosts the article on their websites, and in fact, anyone can peer review it and give comments, and then it goes back to the author, and after the corrections, and then it can come back again. So preprint is before, at the time of submission, the initial submission, and anyone can read it and give and peer review that.
Yeah. So there are 2 situations where this is used. One is like in COVID, where you want to get your findings across to people very fast.
Yes.
That is one situation. The other is if you are in the cutting edge of research, at such a cutting edge that you feel that even during the time where it is getting peer reviewed, somebody will copy your work and do it in the meantime before you can even publish it. So there are the 2 situations.
Yeah.
Dr. Usha, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say about this plagiarism issue. The reason why a lot of Indian articles have a lot of plagiarism, apart from personal integrity issues, one technique which I learned when I was in McMaster is, one of the chief editors took a lecture on just plagiarism. So what he suggested is, you pick out all the articles which you want to read them, put them aside, and write it in your own words. Once you do that, then the chances that you will end up with any plagiarism check working against you will be very low, because it's a question of just rephrasing the statements in your own words. Once you do that, that is a better way to write your articles.
Okay.
Ma'am, I'll just like to add, there's one type which is called paraphrasing. So even though even if you are taking an idea from someone else, so you need to give credit, you need to cite that source actually. So what you have suggested is a very good idea, because at least you don't copy paste. So, but still you need to credit the idea, So because the definition of plagiarism is very, very wide now. So it doesn't only mean copy pasting, which is very, very simple form of plagiarism that we understand.
Yes, I agree with you. We have to obviously give reference to the source of the idea.
Thank you all very much.